pleasure to be joining your conference in a subject that is really important and timely. So I will tell you about the PREFER project, and if you take the next slide, that is an IMI project with a collaboration between academic partners funded by the European Commission and the FPR, the European Federation of Pharmaceutical Companies. It was led by Novartis company and by Uppsala University, Conny Berlin, and myself. Next slide, please. So the background of this project is that there is, as everyone in this conference know very well, that there is an increasing recognition of the importance to incorporate patient values, patient views in all kinds of medical decision making. Next slide, please. So the incorporation of patient preferences is something that is of particular value when you select an endpoint for a development of medicine or a medical intervention, that you find the right outcomes that matters to patients, that are relevant for them, that you find when there are several treatment options, that is one that is relevant for the particular patient or particular group of patient, and which I will come back to later, which is very important, the willingness to accept trade-offs when there are both benefits and risks. That is often the case in medical decision making. So next slide, please. So the MDT Medical Device Innovation Consortium of FDA coined this definition that we have been using, so I will read it. It's important. So preference information that we get is the information resulting from either a qualitative or a quantitative assessment of the relative desirability or acceptability to patients of several specified alternatives or choices among different outcomes or different attributes that are relative to different kinds of health interventions. So next slide, please. And when you ask about patient views or patient values or patient preferences, there are three set of different questions that in order to answer them, you need to use different methods. So when we ask the first question, what matters to patients, what is important for them, that is something that we do when we look for patient-reported outcomes, what kind of benefits and what kind of risk, adverse reactions they find important, what really matters to them. But we need more information. We need also information on the second question here. Not only what matters, but how much does it matter? How important is this? In order to do that, you need to do some kind of ranking survey and you need more sophisticated methodologies. But what we really want to get at in the preference studies and incorporating patient views is the third questions. What matters most? There is often a trade-off, as for all kinds of medical interventions and treatment. There are nice opportunities expecting for the treatment in terms of benefits, imperfect cure, imperfect improvement, but there are also risk of adverse reactions. I will take a couple of examples about that later. So we ask, since there is no risk-free society, not in medicine, not in any other part of society, we want to know what is the maximum acceptable risk for a given benefit for a patient group. And I will come back to that later. So next slide, please. So the background of this project and what we have been doing during these 6 years, it ended in May this year, is that there is a lack of understanding of how, in what way can these preferences of patients inform medical decision making and, at a later stage, regulatory decisions. And regarding regulatory decisions, Mireille Müller, who was one of the central figures of the preferred project from Novartis, will have a talk after me, so she will complement that. If you take the next slide, you see now that there are 4 squares with different colors, and on the I-axis you have the benefits, and then you have the risk, and there are, in some decisions, there's not really a need for eliciting patient preferences. That is the upper left corner. When you have a very high benefit and you have a very low risk, preference information provide little additional information for the decision making. And likewise, in the red lower right corner, when you have a very low benefit but a high risk, preference information is also of less value. But it might be some patients that actually would go for this anyway. Depends on the risk taking attitudes. If you go to the lower left corner, the yellow one, sorry, where there's low benefit and low risk, there's not very much room, but for some of the patients, a subset of patients, they want to have a limited benefit in their lives. And the most valuable situation for patient preference elicitation is the upper right corner, the orange corner, where you have high benefit, but you also have high risk. I will take an example of that, where present preference information regarding patients' willingness to accept high risk. And we know that they will differ depending on in what stage of the disease are the patients, what is the background, what is the family history, what is the family situation, and so on. So I will take an example now from psoriasis treatment. If you take the next slide, you should be on number 9 now, I hope. So what drives your choice in terms of psoriasis treatment? This is one of the first good, really breakthrough preference studies that was done. You have benefits, you have also risk. So if you take the next slide, what we have in psoriasis is an expected benefit, the clearing of the psoriasis plaque. What was measured here is the psoriasis area and severity index, and if you could improve the score, that is the relationship between the body surface area that is cleared and the expected and foreseen risk. If you take the next slide, you should be on number 11. So if you have a couple of situations here, one for complete clearance of 25% body surface area with mild plaques, respondents were willing to accept a 20% risk of serious infection. And there was a variation in that. For complete clearance of 25% of body surface area with severe plaques, these are patients that are far more advanced in their development of the disease. Respondents were willing to accept a 54% risk of serious infection. And this is important and very valuable information for decision making by those regulators that set the standards, by the companies, and of course by the individual doctor who is treating the patient, to realize that patients here are willing to do different things. But the issue is more complicated than that, and I will come back to that. Next slide is only the conclusion that respondents were willing to accept risks above likely clinical exposures for improvement in psoriasis symptoms. But individual risk tolerance may vary, and risk tolerance is something that you can measure with preference studies. And there's a reference here to the publication in question. If you go to the next slide, number 13, the goals of the preferred project was to establish recommendations to support the development of guidelines for industry that we depend on for doing all these studies, for regulatory authorities that will receive the information and the claims from the industry studies, and the HTA bodies, the health and technology assessment bodies, and the payers, who are those who are going to take a stand on how the cost and the burden are distributed, and they should also be able to use and are interested in the preference information. So the question is on why, when, and how to include patient preferences to inform medical decision making. And if you take the next slide, there are a lot of methodology. I will come back to those later in my presentation. What we wanted to do also is to see if EMA could provide a qualification opinion. The qualification opinion is a very important thing for industry, for biotech companies in all development, to get a quality check on the method that you are proposing for doing something. And we wanted to have that opinion for a framework for setting up and designing, and for some important points to consider when you select the appropriate method for in a patient preference study. And this is all of you who have been included in qualification, getting qualification advice or opinion, and know that this is quite a long road. But in April this year, we got the favorable conclusion from the CHMP, the Committee for Medicinal Product for Human Use, at the EMA. And what they said is that the proposed research framework and points to consider document is generally endorsed as a comprehensive reference document for planning and conducting patient preference studies. And that is really a good way forward for including patient preference studies in more situations of medical decision making and in medical drug development. What they also said, which is very important, that all situations are different. The kind of drug, the kind of population, the kind of intervention that you are proposing will need special and detailed scrutiny in each case. So on a case-by-case basis, you have to work this through. But by prefer, you have the general framework, and you have the important points to consider for some of the most commonly used methods. I will come back to present them later. If you take the next slide, I will send you, there will be at the end of my presentation, there will be a link where you can find these preferred recommendations and now online with the qualification opinion and also a lot of other material. If we take this one here, the next slide, if you be on 17 now, then this is a approach for presentation of what is in the recommendation. So one important point, I will come back to some of these to explain in more detail later in my presentation. You need to make an assessment of the value of patient preference studies. Not all situations in medical decision making and medical product development are preference sensitive, as we said. We have the framework presented with provides you with the stepwise insights in order to start setting up, designing, showing the right population and so on for a preference study. We have one important chapter in this recommendation, that is the involvement of patients and other stakeholders. It's extremely important to do this very early on, as it is always very important to, when you start a preference study, early on, have a contact with the regulatory authorities, EMA or FDA, to anchor what you are proposing to do. In the PREFER project, we conducted, in addition to identifying, evaluating methodologies, we also tested them in 8 different clinical case studies for different clinical situations. And we, of course, had in all these cases real patients participating in providing advice and expert insight into the definition of the attributes, the characteristics that are of interest for a certain intervention, and what outcomes are, and how to conduct it, and how to involve other patients in the decision making. And this is extremely important. We also have a section here on the different preference methods, and here we have a presentation of them all. 11 different methods for elicitation, but there are methods both for qualitative assessment and for quantitative assessment. We have a section on psychological construct that is really important. When you do preference studies, as I will come back to, you are bound to find heterogeneity because people are different, patients are different, patients are at different stages of the disease, they have different background, they have different knowledge, health literacy, different grasp of numbers, numeracy. The risk tolerance is different and the risk-taking behavior is different. And there are a lot of those that have their instruments available, and you can run them and use them in order to understand the heterogeneity in the responses, in the preference of between different populations of patients and different cultures of patients. The next section 7 is also important. What, from an ethical point of view, I'm a bioethicist. It's extremely important that the preferences that we then will move on to use in decision making by regulatory authorities, that these preferences are well informed. And that is something that came out from numerous focus group and interview studies that we had with stakeholder groups in the beginning of the preferred project. One of the first questions the regulatory authority will ask you, as I will say later, is that when you come presenting a result of a preference study, the first question they ask is that now did the patients understand what you propose to them? So we have developed educational material, and there are different versions of that, some more or less interactive, and this is an important part in order to make sure as far as you can that when you present choices to patients, they actually really understand the difference and how it relates to them. We had a 6-year project. You managed to complete a lot, but of course there are more things to do. So we have identified a number of questions, research questions that need to be researched upon or investigated. So the preferred recommendations and the preferred results is really an invitation to the whole community in order to move on in this field. So next slide, you should be on number 18 now. This is the definition. These are the main questions. And next slide, please. So the framework that we propose is intended to help the discussion when you start planning to define the objectives, you define the design for the study, and how to conduct, how to do the analysis, how to do the interpretation of the result. And of course, this is one framework, and there are other frameworks available. So ISPOR, the Professional Society for Health Economics and Health and Outcomes Research, they are also doing these kinds. So we see this as a complementary to what they are doing. Another significant organization is the IAPOR, the International Academy for Health Preference Research, where a lot of our members are members in both of those of the preferred project. So we see this as complementary. Next slide, please. There are different methods to choose in between, and they are appropriate for in different situations. And you have to choose the most appropriate method. And one question is about the methodology. This is a very burdensome methodology to use. Is it difficult to understand for the participants? Do you need to have some cognitive capacity sufficient enough in order to respond to this? What is its feasibility, cost, and so on? So you need to select on the basis of what is the preference sensitive situation, the cognitive burden for the patient, stakeholder acceptance, and available budget and time. And what we did in the Prefer project, and all this is documented as you can find online, I will show you later, is that we compared different methods, swing weighting versus discrete choice experiments, threshold techniques versus best for scaling, and so on. I will come back to that shortly. So next slide. So we selected 5 methods, and we did this because these are the 5 methods that have been used most widely in health preference research, and there's the most available evidence that we have for this. But you can use other methods, but we describe these as a sort of first run. So the discrete choice experiment, which is a really advanced instrument where you use a special software, and if you do it correctly and have the right number, so you can have the right power for your study, you can use it in some cases to predict uptakes, for example, of a certain treatment, which is a very important feature of a preference study for, say, health technology assessment or those planning to set up new programs. We have suggested and defined the important points related to types of best for scaling, a threshold technique, and also swing weighting. All those are described in more detail for your information. Next slide, please. And as I said, patients are different, and you need to account for heterogeneity in preference studies, and you need to find ways to do that. And we have shown how some of it can be done. We haven't provided any results for an individual meeting between a doctor and his or her patient. Doctors can use what we have seen on different groups, but we still work with populations, but in these populations there's also a large difference in heterogeneity, and you have to account for that. So the next slide is what I've already said, that you need to make sure that when you present the choices, that patients really understand it. That is why, for example, when you do a discrete choice experiment, you have preceded it with qualitative investigations, individual interviews, focus groups. You have expert interpretation of this, and to see that this is relevant, you have patient input when you design the actual choices, and you test it in pilot studies. Of course, it is a very important stepwise procedure when doing this, in order to get preferences that are as well informed as they can be. Next slide, please. So I see I'm running out of time, and I'm sorry because I was late because of these technical problems. These are the preferred partners. So it's a mixture of, as I said, with academic, public partners and private partners located all over the world, and important stakeholder and stakeholder advisory groups. So we had patients as partners in the different proceedings of the project. European Patient Forum, the Muscular Dystrophy UK, we did one of the clinical case studies for neuromuscular disorders in UK, and that was very helpful, and several others, and also expert advice throughout the project with regulators. So we had both EMA and FDA on board. EMA, for understandable reasons, they needed to withdraw when we got on with the qualification opinion, but because they wanted to be free to scrutinize that, of course. So that is the last slide, I think, on my presentation. I'm happy to take questions if that is possible via phone.